What would you do if you watched police officers handcuff a quiet woman at a gas station, only to find out minutes later that the Pentagon itself was trying to reach them? And what if the woman they treated like a criminal turned out to be connected to one of the most powerful military figures in the country? Tonight's story isn't just about a wrongful arrest. It's about assumptions, power, silence, and the terrifying moment people realize they've crossed a line they can't uncross. Make sure you stay until the very end, because the final confrontation between the officer and the woman he arrested will leave you speechless. It was nearly 11:30 at night when Evelyn Carter pulled into the gas station just outside the edge of Arlington County. Rain tapped softly against the windshield of her dark SUV as the neon lights from the station reflected across the wet pavement in distorted streaks of blue and white. The highway behind her was nearly empty now, and the entire town seemed quieter than usual, like the night itself was holding its breath. Evelyn turned off the engine and sat still for a moment before stepping out. She looked exhausted, not physically weak, but emotionally drained in the way people become after carrying responsibility for too many years without ever speaking about it. She wore a long charcoal coat over professional clothes, her natural curls pulled neatly back, her expression calm but distant. Nothing about her appearance suggested disorder. Nothing about her behavior invited attention. In fact, the most noticeable thing about Evelyn Carter was how carefully she seemed to avoid being noticed at all. She moved with quiet discipline, the kind developed by people who spent years living beside powerful institutions without ever wanting to become part of their spotlight. Inside the gas station, an older cashier glanced up briefly from behind the counter the moment she walked in. At first, it was nothing more than a routine look. But then his eyes shifted toward the large black SUV parked outside. Something about it held his attention longer than necessary. The vehicle was expensive, government-grade, heavily tinted, and carried a small military parking decal near the windshield. Subtle, almost invisible unless someone was specifically looking for it. Evelyn walked calmly through the aisles, picked up a bottle of water and a few small travel items, then placed them gently on the counter. The cashier's expression had changed by then. Slightly tighter around the eyes. Slightly more suspicious. He glanced toward the window again. "You driving that vehicle outside?" he asked casually. Evelyn nodded once. "Yes." The cashier forced a thin smile, but his eyes stayed fixed on her face as if comparing her answer against something in his mind that didn't quite fit. "Nice car," he muttered. "Thank you," Evelyn replied softly. That should have been the end of it. But some moments don't announce themselves when they begin. They arrive quietly, then grow teeth later. A man standing near the coffee station had been listening closely to the exchange. Mid-50s, heavy-set, construction jacket. The type of person who carried opinions with complete confidence whether he understood the situation or not. He looked out toward the SUV, then back at Evelyn. "That your husband's car?" he asked. Evelyn paused briefly before answering. "It's mine." The man gave a short laugh under his breath, not loud enough to be openly confrontational, but loud enough to communicate disbelief. Evelyn ignored it. She reached calmly into her purse for payment, but the atmosphere inside the store had already begun to shift in a way that couldn't be reversed easily. The cashier's friendliness disappeared completely now. He stared at the military decal again through the rain-covered glass. "You military?" he asked. "No," Evelyn answered politely. The man near the coffee station folded his arms. "Then how exactly you got a vehicle like that?" Evelyn finally looked directly at him for the first time. Her expression remained calm, but there was something unreadable behind her eyes now. Not fear, not anger, something steadier. "I don't think I need to explain that," she said quietly. The man smirked. "Sounds suspicious to me." And there it was. The moment. Small enough that most people would miss it if they weren't paying attention. The exact second ordinary curiosity transformed into assumption. The cashier cleared his throat awkwardly and glanced toward the phone near the register. Evelyn noticed the movement immediately. So did the man near the coffee machine. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the distant sky. Evelyn placed cash on the counter and picked up her items slowly, deliberately. Her movements remained controlled, but internally she could already feel something familiar beginning to unfold. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had seen this pattern before. The suspicious looks, the subtle shift in tone, the unspoken conclusion forming before facts ever had the chance to exist. She turned toward the exit. Then she heard the cashier's voice behind her. "Ma'am, I think maybe you should wait a second." Evelyn stopped walking. The rain outside intensified, tapping harder against the windows now. Slowly, she turned back around. And in that moment, without anyone fully realizing it yet, everything began spiraling toward a disaster none of them were prepared for. With that said, thanks for watching and until next time. Evelyn stood perfectly still near the doorway, one hand holding the small plastic bag from the counter while the other rested calmly against the strap of her purse. The entire gas station seemed quieter now, as though every sound inside had pulled back to make room for whatever was about to happen next. Even the cashier appeared uncertain after saying the words out loud. But uncertainty had already moved beyond the point where it could stop anything. "Is there a problem?" Evelyn asked calmly. The cashier avoided direct eye contact at first. "It's just, we've had issues around here lately. Stolen vehicles, fake credentials, stuff like that." The man near the coffee station let out another low laugh. "Yeah, and people pretending they belong in places they don't." Evelyn's expression did not change, but something inside the atmosphere hardened slightly. Not aggressively, quietly. The kind of tension that spreads when someone realizes they are no longer being questioned because of evidence, but because someone already decided what they wanted the answer to be. "I paid for my items," Evelyn said softly. "I'd like to leave now." The cashier nodded nervously, but his hand remained near the phone. "I already called someone just to verify things. Standard procedure." Evelyn looked at him carefully. "Police." Neither man answered immediately. That silence was answer enough. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the windows as another vehicle passed on the wet road beyond the station. The rain continued falling steadily now, turning the entire parking lot into a mirror of distorted light and shadow. The customer near the coffee station stepped closer, his confidence growing stronger with every passing second. "If everything's legit, then you got nothing to worry about, right?" Evelyn slowly looked at him again. There was no fear in her face. No panic. But there was disappointment now. Deep disappointment. The kind that comes from recognizing a situation long before it fully reveals itself. "You've already decided something about me," she said quietly. The man shrugged. "People notice things." "No," Evelyn replied softly. "People assume things." The cashier shifted awkwardly behind the register. For a moment, it looked like he regretted making the call at all. But it was too late now. Once authority gets invited into a situation built on assumption, it rarely arrives gently. Red and blue lights suddenly reflected across the front windows. The man near the coffee station smirked slightly and folded his arms tighter across his chest. The cashier looked relieved. Evelyn simply closed her eyes for the briefest second before exhaling slowly through her nose. Not fear. Preparation. The police cruiser pulled into the gas station quickly, tires splashing through shallow rainwater. Two officers stepped out. One younger, quieter, visibly observant. The other older, broader, moving with the kind of aggressive certainty that suggested he had already formed conclusions before even entering the building. Officer Daniel Briggs. Even before he spoke, his presence altered the room immediately. The younger officer hung slightly behind him as they entered the station. Briggs removed his rain-speckled hat and looked directly toward Evelyn almost instantly. "What's going on here?" he asked sharply. The cashier immediately began explaining. "She came in driving that SUV outside. Said it's hers. Military decal on the windshield. Something just didn't feel right. Briggs turned his eyes toward Evelyn again. Slowly. Measuring. "You own the vehicle?" he asked. "Yes." "Registration?" "In the glove compartment." Briggs tilted his head slightly. "And your connection to the military?" Evelyn answered carefully. "Family." "What kind of family?" "My husband." Briggs stared at her for a few seconds too long. Then he gave a short nod that somehow carried disbelief without openly saying it. "What does your husband do?" Evelyn remained calm. "That's personal." The room shifted again. The younger officer glanced briefly toward Briggs as if silently warning him not to escalate too quickly. But Briggs had already begun building a version of the situation inside his head, and every calm answer Evelyn gave only seemed to irritate him more. "Ma'am," Briggs said firmly, "when there's a possible stolen military-connected vehicle involved, cooperation stops being optional." Evelyn looked directly at him now. Still calm. Still composed. But something colder had entered her eyes. "The vehicle isn't stolen," she said quietly. "And I haven't broken any laws." Briggs stepped slightly closer. Then, proving that should be very easy, the younger officer finally spoke for the first time. "Maybe we should just verify registration first." But Briggs barely acknowledged him. His attention remained locked on Evelyn. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of the conversation, something dangerous was beginning to form. Not because of evidence, not because of criminal behavior, but because one man's certainty was slowly becoming more important than the truth itself. Officer Briggs stepped toward the entrance and looked out through the rain-covered windows at the black SUV parked beneath the flickering station lights. The vehicle sat perfectly still, sleek and imposing against the dark night, almost too clean and too expensive for the setting around it. To Briggs, it didn't match the woman standing in front of him. And that mismatch had already become enough for suspicion to harden into belief. "Keys," he said, extending his hand. Evelyn didn't move immediately. "For what purpose?" Briggs gave a dry smile that contained no warmth at all. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. I'm asking a legal question. And I'm giving you a lawful instruction." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably beside him. Something about Evelyn's composure clearly unsettled him, not because it felt threatening, but because it didn't fit the behavior of someone hiding anything. Most people grew nervous under pressure from police. Most people either became defensive or overly cooperative. Evelyn did neither. She simply remained steady. That steadiness was becoming the center of the tension now. The customer near the coffee station watched everything with growing satisfaction, as though the situation was confirming assumptions he'd already decided were true before the officers even arrived. Evelyn slowly reached into her coat pocket and removed the keys. She handed them over carefully. Briggs took them without thanks. "Stay here," he ordered before turning toward the door. Rain immediately soaked his uniform as he crossed the parking lot toward the SUV. The younger officer lingered behind awkwardly with Evelyn inside the station. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then finally, the younger officer cleared his throat quietly. "Ma'am, if there's paperwork in the vehicle, this probably gets resolved pretty fast." Evelyn looked at him calmly. "That depends on whether anyone here actually wants it resolved." The officer didn't answer, because part of him already understood exactly what she meant. Outside, Briggs opened the SUV and began searching aggressively through the interior. The flashlight beam moved rapidly across leather seats, center consoles, compartments. Rain rolled down the windshield in thick streams while the gas station lights reflected across the dark paint. Then Briggs suddenly stopped moving. He had found something. Inside the gas station, the customer near the coffee machine leaned forward eagerly. The cashier looked nervous again now, as though he was no longer fully comfortable with where things were heading. Briggs slammed the SUV door shut and marched back toward the station through the rain with something in his hand. A black identification wallet. Military grade. The moment he stepped inside, his energy had changed. More aggressive. More certain. He held the wallet up toward Evelyn. Interesting thing to leave sitting in plain view. Evelyn's expression remained unreadable. It belongs to my husband. Briggs opened the wallet quickly and pulled out an identification card. His eyes narrowed immediately. The younger officer stepped closer, trying to see it. Whatever Briggs was looking at, it clearly wasn't what he expected. Still, instead of calming him down, it seemed to push him further into confrontation. "You expect me to believe this?" Briggs asked sharply. "I'm not asking you to believe anything," Evelyn answered. "I'm telling you the truth." Briggs held up the identification card. "You're claiming your husband is a 4-star general." The cashier's face drained of color slightly. The customer near the coffee station laughed outright. "Yeah, right." Evelyn didn't even look at him. "Yes," she said calmly. The room fell silent for half a second. Then Briggs shook his head slowly. "No, I don't buy it." And there it was again. Not evidence. Not verification. Personal belief becoming more powerful than documented reality. The younger officer spoke carefully. "Maybe we should run the ID through the system." Briggs ignored him completely. Instead, he stared directly at Evelyn as though trying to force cracks into her composure through pressure alone. "You know impersonating military officials is a federal crime?" he asked. "I'm aware. And you still want to stick with this story?" Evelyn's eyes hardened slightly now. Not emotionally. Just with exhaustion. The exhaustion of realizing this situation was moving exactly where she feared it would from the beginning. "It isn't a story," she said quietly. Briggs stepped closer again. "Then why does none of this make sense?" Evelyn held his gaze for the first time without looking away. "Because you decided what I was before you asked who I was." The sentence landed heavily in the room. Even the younger officer looked down briefly after hearing it. But Briggs only grew colder. His pride had become involved now. And once pride enters a situation like this, reason usually exits quietly through the back door. He handed the ID wallet to the younger officer abruptly. "Run everything." Then he looked back at Evelyn. "And until we sort this out," he said firmly, "you're not going anywhere." The younger officer hesitated for only a second before taking the identification wallet and moving toward the patrol car outside. Rain hammered against the roof as he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Evelyn alone inside the gas station with Officer Briggs, the cashier, and the customer whose suspicion had now evolved into open judgment. Briggs kept his eyes fixed on Evelyn the entire time. Not casually. Deliberately. As if he believed prolonged pressure would eventually force her into contradiction. "You know what bothers me?" he said after a long silence. "People who think confidence can replace facts." Evelyn answered calmly. "Facts don't seem to be the problem here." Briggs folded his arms. "You're right. The problem is your story doesn't line up." "My story? The expensive SUV. Military credentials. A 4-star general husband." He shook his head slightly. "You expect me to believe someone like you just casually stops at a random gas station alone in the middle of the night?" The cashier immediately looked uncomfortable after hearing the phrase "someone like you," but Briggs either didn't notice or didn't care. Evelyn did notice. Of course she did, but her expression remained composed. "What exactly is someone like me supposed to mean, officer?" For the first time, Briggs paused. Only briefly, but long enough to realize he'd said more than he intended aloud. "That's not what I meant," he muttered quickly. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Then what did you mean?" Briggs didn't answer, because answering honestly would expose something he wasn't prepared to confront yet, not publicly, not even internally. Instead, he redirected. "Where is your husband right now?" "I don't discuss his location." "That's convenient. It's protocol." Briggs let out a short laugh under his breath. "You really committed to this." The customer near the coffee station smirked again, feeding off Briggs' confidence-like validation. Outside, the younger officer sat inside the patrol vehicle running the identification through the system. At first, everything appeared routine. But then the computer paused longer than expected. He frowned slightly. Tried again. This time the screen flashed restricted access warnings he had never seen before on a normal traffic check. He straightened in his seat. Then a second notification appeared. Federal authorization required. The younger officer blinked slowly, staring at the screen. His expression changed instantly. Back inside the gas station, Briggs continued circling verbally, pushing harder with each question. How long you been using that vehicle? It's registered legally. That's not what I asked. Evelyn remained calm. Long enough. Briggs stepped closer again, lowering his voice slightly now. Here's what I think. I think you found access to something you shouldn't have. I think you're hoping people won't question you if you act confident enough. The cashier looked increasingly nervous now. Even the customer near the coffee station had grown quieter. Because something about Evelyn's stillness was becoming difficult to ignore. She didn't look trapped. She didn't look desperate. If anything, she looked disappointed. As though the outcome unfolding in front of her was something she had hoped to avoid rather than something she feared. Then her phone vibrated softly inside her purse. Briggs immediately held out his hand. Give me the phone. Evelyn stared at him for a moment. Why? Because right now I don't know who you're contacting. It could be my family. It could also be someone helping you maintain this little performance. The phrase little performance lingered heavily in the air. Slowly, Evelyn reached into her purse and removed the phone. The screen illuminated briefly. One incoming call. Unknown secure number. The moment Briggs saw the encrypted federal call banner across the screen, his expression shifted slightly. Only slightly, but enough. Evelyn looked at the phone. Then back at Briggs. If I were you, she said quietly, I would answer that. Briggs stared at her for a long second before taking the phone from her hand. The entire gas station felt frozen now. Rain hammered against the windows. The younger officer remained outside in the patrol vehicle staring at federal warnings flashing across his screen. And inside the station, Officer Briggs slowly raised the phone to his ear. Yeah, he answered sharply. The voice on the other end spoke for less than 5 seconds. That was all it took. The color drained from Briggs' face almost immediately. His posture changed. His breathing changed. And for the first time since entering the gas station, Officer Daniel Briggs looked uncertain. Briggs lowered the phone slowly from his ear, but he didn't speak immediately. For several seconds, he simply stood there staring at Evelyn as though the person in front of him had transformed into someone entirely different without physically changing at all. The cashier noticed it first. The shift, the sudden fracture in Briggs' confidence. A minute earlier, he had controlled the room completely. Every word, every movement, every accusation carried the weight of certainty. But now that certainty was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. Doubt. Officer. The cashier asked nervously. Briggs ignored him. His eyes remained locked on Evelyn. What exactly did you tell them? He asked quietly. Evelyn's expression didn't move. I didn't speak to anyone. That call came from them, not me. Briggs swallowed once. Hard. Outside, the younger officer stepped quickly out of the patrol vehicle and hurried back toward the station through the rain, his face pale and tense. The moment he entered, he looked directly at Briggs. We need to talk, he said urgently. Now. The tone alone was enough to change the atmosphere completely. The customer near the coffee station shifted uncomfortably for the first time all night. Even he could feel it now. Something had gone terribly wrong. Briggs motioned toward the side of the counter, trying to maintain control of the situation publicly. But the moment the two officers stepped aside, the younger officer spoke in a rushed whisper. The system flagged her immediately, he said. Restricted federal clearance. Pentagon-linked records. I couldn't even access half the file. Briggs stared at him silently. Then the younger officer added the sentence that changed everything. Her husband is real. Briggs looked back toward Evelyn instinctively. She stood exactly where she had been the entire time. Calm, composed, not triumphant, not angry. And somehow that made the situation feel even worse. Because she wasn't reacting like someone who had just won an argument. She was reacting like someone who already knew this would happen from the beginning. Briggs lowered his voice further. "You sure?" The younger officer nodded immediately. "Positive. And there's more. The dispatcher got contacted directly by Federal Defense Communications less than 2 minutes after I ran the ID." Briggs felt something cold move through his chest. Federal Defense Communications. Not local command. Not state authorities. Federal. The younger officer continued carefully. "Whoever she is, this isn't normal." Briggs rubbed his jaw tightly, trying to regain control of his thoughts. "Okay. Fine. We sort it out quietly." But even as he said it, another pair of headlights suddenly swept across the gas station windows. Then another. Both officers turned toward the parking lot. Black SUVs. 2 of them. Moving fast. No sirens. No markings. The vehicles pulled sharply into the station and stopped near the pumps with unsettling precision. The cashier's face went completely pale. The customer near the coffee machine took a slow step backward. 4 individuals exited the SUVs almost simultaneously. Dark suits. Earpieces. Controlled movements. Not local law enforcement. Not military police. Something else. The air inside the station changed instantly. One of the suited men entered first, scanning the room once before locking eyes with Evelyn. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. "Are you all right?" Evelyn gave a small nod. "I'm fine." Then the man turned toward Briggs. And the temperature in his voice dropped immediately. "Which one of you detained Mrs. Evelyn Carter?" The question hit the room like concrete. Not because it was loud. Because it carried authority that didn't require volume. Briggs stepped forward carefully. "I'm Officer Briggs. We were conducting an investigation regarding suspicious." The suited man cut him off instantly. "Did you place her under investigative detention?" Briggs hesitated. "Yes." The man stared at him for a long second without blinking. Then he asked quietly, "On what federal basis?" Briggs opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because suddenly every decision he made tonight sounded smaller and weaker inside his own head than it had 5 minutes earlier. The second suited official stepped inside now, holding a phone to his ear before handing it directly toward Briggs. "Take this." Briggs looked down uncertainly. "Who is it?" The man answered flatly. "Pentagon Command." The entire room went silent. Even the rain outside somehow felt distant now. Slowly, Briggs took the phone with trembling fingers and raised it to his ear. A calm voice immediately spoke from the other end. "Officer Briggs, this situation is now under federal review. You are instructed to fully cooperate and remain exactly where you are until investigators arrive." Briggs felt his stomach drop. Federal review. Investigators. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It had become something else entirely. And standing only a few feet away, Evelyn Carter finally looked directly at him again. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet sadness that somehow felt heavier than either. Then she spoke softly. "I asked if you were sure." The words stayed suspended in the air long after Evelyn said them. "I asked if you were sure." Not spoken with pride. Not spoken as revenge. Just truth. And somehow that made them hit harder than anger ever could. Officer Briggs lowered the phone slowly, his hand visibly less steady now. A few minutes earlier, he had controlled every part of the interaction. Now he looked like a man trying to mentally outrun consequences already arriving faster than he could process them. The suited officials moved through the gas station calmly. Efficiently, without wasted motion. One positioned himself near the entrance while another quietly spoke into an earpiece. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Authority like this didn't perform itself loudly. It simply existed. The younger officer stood near the patrol car outside, frozen between confusion and disbelief. He had spent years in law enforcement and had never seen a response unfold this quickly. Pentagon linked communication within minutes. Federal vehicles arriving without local dispatch involvement. Investigators already mobilizing before anyone even fully understood what was happening. None of this was normal. Inside the station, the customer near the coffee machine slowly backed away from the center of the room. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely. He avoided eye contact now, suddenly aware that the situation he had helped escalate was far larger than the assumptions that created it. The cashier looked physically sick. One of the suited men approached Evelyn carefully. "Ma'am, we can relocate you immediately if you prefer." Evelyn shook her head softly. "No, I'll stay." The official nodded once, respecting the decision without question. That detail didn't escape Briggs either. No one here was treating her like someone connected to power. They were treating her like someone who already was power. And the distinction terrified him. Briggs finally found his voice again. "Nobody intended for this to become a federal incident," the suited man interrupted calmly. Briggs stopped speaking. The man stepped closer, his expression controlled but cold. "Officer, do you understand why Pentagon oversight was triggered?" Briggs swallowed hard. "Because of her husband." "No." The answer came instantly. "Because of her." That sentence hit even harder. The younger officer looked up sharply from near the entrance. Even the cashier's eyes widened slightly. The suited official continued. "Mrs. Carter is attached to multiple active defense protocols connected to General Carter's operations. The moment her identity entered a restricted system under detainment conditions, automated escalation procedures activated." Briggs stared blankly. Half the words barely registered anymore. Defense protocols, automated escalation, restricted systems. The situation had moved completely beyond his understanding. And yet the worst part, the part digging deepest into his chest, was realizing none of this had been hidden from him. He simply refused to believe it when it stood directly in front of him. Evelyn remained silent while the conversation unfolded around her. Her calmness had become almost unbearable to witness now. Not because it looked superior, but because it looked exhausted. Like someone who had spent years learning exactly how dangerous assumptions could become once authority attached itself to them. One of the federal officials received another message through his earpiece before turning toward Evelyn again. "Ma'am, the general has been notified." For the first time all night, something flickered subtly across Evelyn's face. Not fear. Concern. A quiet kind of concern that seemed deeper than the situation itself. "That wasn't necessary," she said softly. "With respect, ma'am, protocol required it." Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly. And the tiny reaction unsettled Briggs more than anything else had so far. Because until this moment, he had unconsciously imagined the husband, the four-star general, as the true source of power behind all this. But now he was beginning to understand something far more uncomfortable. Evelyn Carter had never needed saving. The system itself had moved to protect her. Outside, more headlights appeared in the distance. Additional vehicles. Approaching. The gas station no longer felt like a random roadside stop. It felt like the center of something spiraling rapidly outward into places none of them could see. Briggs finally looked directly at Evelyn again. "I didn't know," he said quietly. Evelyn met his eyes for a long moment. "I know," she replied. And somehow those two words carried more disappointment than accusation ever could. The rain had slowed outside, but the atmosphere inside the gas station only grew heavier with each passing minute. No one seemed to know where to stand anymore. The cashier remained frozen behind the counter, pretending to organize receipts with trembling hands just to avoid looking directly at anyone. The customer near the coffee station had completely withdrawn into silence now, standing off to the side as though distance alone could separate him from the role he played in what happened. But the real collapse was happening inside Officer Briggs. It wasn't visible all at once. It revealed itself slowly, in the stiffness of his posture, in the way he kept glancing toward the federal officials without understanding how to interact with them, in the silence that replaced the confidence he had walked in with earlier. Because certainty is easy when you believe the system belongs entirely to you. It becomes much harder when you suddenly realize there are levels above your understanding, levels that were watching the entire time. One of the suited officials quietly approached the younger officer outside and requested access to the patrol vehicle systems. The younger officer complied immediately without resistance. Briggs noticed. "Why do you need the car?" he asked. The official answered without emotion. "Bodycam retrieval." A cold feeling spread through Briggs' chest instantly. Bodycam footage. Every word, every assumption, every escalation. Recorded. Permanent. Suddenly, the entire night replayed inside his mind differently than before. Not through his own perspective, but through the eyes of people who would later review it frame by frame. The comments, the tone, the disbelief, the phrase "someone like you." He felt sick. The federal official continued calmly. "Standard review procedure." But Briggs already understood what that really meant. Nothing about tonight would stay local anymore. Inside the station, Evelyn sat quietly near the window now, untouched coffee resting in front of her. One of the officials had offered her water, dry towels, even transportation away from the scene, but she declined all of it politely. She remained calm. Not because she enjoyed any part of this. Because she had learned long ago that composure was sometimes the only protection people allowed her to keep. The younger officer finally gathered enough courage to approach her carefully. "Ma'am," he began awkwardly. "I just want to say, I should have stepped in sooner." Evelyn looked up at him. And unlike Briggs, the younger officer couldn't hold her gaze for very long. Not because she looked intimidating. Because she looked hurt. That was worse. "You hesitated," Evelyn said softly. The officer lowered his eyes. "Yes. You knew something felt wrong." He nodded slowly. "And you stayed quiet." The younger officer swallowed hard. There was no anger in her voice. Only honesty. And honesty without anger can sometimes feel impossible to defend against. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Evelyn studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. "I believe you." That forgiveness should have eased him. Instead, it made him feel worse. Across the room, Briggs listened silently to every word. The distance between himself and the younger officer suddenly felt enormous. Because the younger officer still had something Briggs was rapidly losing: the ability to admit uncertainty. Briggs had mistaken certainty for authority all night long. And now that certainty was collapsing publicly around him. One of the federal officials approached Briggs again. "Investigators are en route from D.C." Briggs rubbed his forehead tightly. "This really necessary?" The man stared at him blankly. "You detained the spouse of a 4-star general connected to active defense operations based on unsupported suspicion." Briggs tried to respond, but the official continued before he could. "In a public setting, while armed civilians recorded portions of the incident. After accessing restricted credentials." "Yes, Officer Briggs. It's necessary." The words landed with brutal precision. Not emotional. Clinical. Which somehow made them feel more devastating. Briggs looked toward Evelyn again, searching for something: anger, arrogance, triumph, anything that would make this easier to emotionally categorize. But there was none. She simply looked tired. Tired in a way that suggested this wasn't the first time people had decided who she was before allowing her to exist as herself. That realization finally began cutting deeper into Briggs than the federal consequences. Because somewhere underneath all the protocol violations and escalating investigations, he was starting to confront a truth he didn't want to name. If Evelyn Carter had looked different, he probably never would have stopped her at all. That realization stayed buried inside Briggs' mind like something sharp beneath the skin. He tried not to look directly at it. Tried to focus instead on procedure, on policy, on the growing number of federal personnel moving quietly around the gas station. But the thought kept returning anyway. If she had looked different, would any of this have happened? The question followed him with increasing weight. Outside, the rain finally began easing into a light mist. Red and blue patrol lights reflected across the wet pavement while the black federal SUVs remained parked with unsettling stillness nearby. The entire gas station now felt isolated from the rest of the world, as though normal time had stopped operating there. One of the federal officials stepped outside to take another call while another began speaking quietly with the younger officer near the patrol car. Every conversation seemed controlled, efficient, practiced. No chaos, no panic, and that calmness only intensified the pressure. Because Briggs realized these people were used to situations far more serious than this. To them, this wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. That frightened him more than anger would have. Inside the station, Evelyn remained seated by the window, staring absently out into the darkness beyond the pumps. She hadn't touched the coffee sitting in front of her. Her hands rested quietly together in her lap, perfectly steady despite everything that had happened. The cashier finally approached her cautiously. "Ma'am," he began nervously. "I just wanna say, I didn't mean for any of this." Evelyn looked at him kindly, but there was exhaustion behind her eyes now. "You made a call," she said softly. The cashier nodded quickly. "I thought something was off." What exactly felt off? The question froze him immediately. Because suddenly he realized he didn't have a clean answer. Not one he could say out loud honestly. It was just, he hesitated. The vehicle, the decal, the situation. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Or me." The cashier's face tightened, and his silence answered her more clearly than words could. Across the room, Briggs listened again without speaking. Every conversation tonight seemed to circle back toward the same uncomfortable truth. Not evidence, not behavior, perception, assumption, and the terrifying speed at which people turned both into certainty. The gas station door opened suddenly as another federal official entered quickly. His expression was serious now. "The general's arriving sooner than expected," he said. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Even the other federal personnel straightened slightly at the news. Briggs felt tension lock into his shoulders again. Until now, everything had still felt partially manageable, as though perhaps the situation could remain administrative, procedural, distant. But the arrival of the general made it real in a completely different way. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. A 4-star general was personally coming here. To this gas station. Because of him. The younger officer looked visibly nervous now too. "How soon?" The official checked his watch briefly. 10 minutes. Maybe less. Briggs exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. "Look, before he gets here, maybe I should explain directly to Mrs. Carter that this was all a misunderstanding." The federal official gave him a long look. "Officer Briggs, you still think the problem was misunderstanding?" Briggs frowned slightly. Then what was it? The official didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "The problem is that she repeatedly told you the truth, and you decided truth required your personal belief before it could exist." The sentence hit hard. Harder than threats. Harder than consequences. Because Briggs knew it was accurate. And somewhere deep down, he had known it long before the federal vehicles ever arrived. He looked toward Evelyn again. For the first time all night, he saw her differently, not as a suspect, not as a problem, not even as someone connected to powerful people. He saw a woman who had walked into a gas station exhausted from life, and ended up handcuffed emotionally by assumptions before anyone ever checked facts. And suddenly the badge on his chest felt heavier than it ever had before. Not powerful, heavy. Outside, distant headlights appeared through the mist-covered road beyond the station. Different from the others. Long black vehicles moving with controlled speed. The federal officials noticed immediately. One touched his earpiece. Another straightened his jacket subtly. The younger officer whispered under his breath, almost involuntarily. "Oh no." Because deep down, everyone understood the same thing now. The moment General Carter stepped out of that vehicle, nothing about this night would stay small anymore. The first black vehicle rolled in slowly through the mist, followed by another, then another, each one moving with deliberate precision, not urgency. No sirens, no chaos, just controlled arrival, like the night itself had been prepared for this moment long before anyone at the gas station realized it. Briggs felt his throat tighten as he watched the convoy settle into position. This wasn't local response. This wasn't even standard federal escalation anymore. This was arrival of command. The doors of the lead vehicle opened almost in sync. And when the man stepped out, everything inside the gas station seemed to recalibrate around him instantly. General Marcus Carter. 4-star rank. No visible tension in his posture, no wasted movement, no emotional display that could be misread as uncertainty. He moved like someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where silence meant more than speech. The federal officials inside the gas station immediately adjusted their stance. Not dramatically, but enough. Respect wasn't requested in his presence. It happened automatically. Briggs noticed that before anything else. The general didn't look around immediately. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He simply paused outside the station for a brief moment, as if confirming something internally, then stepped inside. And the moment he did, his eyes found Evelyn. Everything else in the room became secondary. The cashier stopped breathing properly. The customer near the coffee station instinctively stepped back another half step. Even the younger officer outside straightened without realizing it. But Evelyn didn't move at first. She just looked at him. Quietly. Like someone who had been holding tension for hours finally allowing it to exist without interruption. Then she stood up. The general walked toward her without hesitation. And for the first time all night, the atmosphere wasn't about suspicion or authority. It was about connection. When he reached her, he stopped just a few feet away. Not touching her, not immediately speaking, just looking at her. Then his voice softened in a way no one else had heard all night. "You didn't have to stay here," he said. Evelyn gave a small, tired exhale. "I wasn't going to leave this behind for someone else to explain incorrectly." A faint pause. Then something almost unnoticeable crossed the general's expression. Not anger. Concern mixed with disappointment, but controlled, restrained. He turned slightly, looking at Briggs for the first time. And that single glance made Briggs feel like the room had suddenly lost all excess air. "You detained my wife," the general said calmly. Not a question, a statement. Briggs opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. The words he had rehearsed earlier in his mind, procedure, suspicion, verification, they all felt completely insufficient now. I was conducting an investigation based on suspicious circumstances," he finally managed. The general nodded slowly, as if absorbing the information without reaction. Then he looked at the federal officials. Bodycam footage confirmed. "Yes, sir," one of them replied immediately. "Full sequence." "Yes." Another pause. Then the general turned back toward Briggs. What exactly was the suspicion? Briggs hesitated. And in that hesitation, something inside him cracked. Because suddenly, saying it out loud sounded worse than it had sounded in his head. "Vehicle registration didn't immediately verify," he said. "And?" the general asked. Briggs swallowed. And her explanation regarding ownership seemed inconsistent. The general studied him quietly for a long moment. Not aggressively, not emotionally, just observing. Then he spoke again. "You escalated a civilian interaction to detainment level based on what you felt was inconsistent." Briggs said nothing, because that was exactly what happened. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it. Evelyn finally spoke softly from beside the general. "It wasn't just him," she said. The general looked at her immediately. She continued, not accusing, just stating. "It was everyone in the room." The assumption came first. Everything after was just justification. That landed differently. Not as blame, as truth. The cashier dropped his gaze immediately. The customer near the coffee station looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Even Briggs felt it in a deeper way now, not as punishment but recognition. Because she wasn't wrong. The general turned slightly toward the federal officials. "I want every recording secured. Full chain of custody." Yes, sir. And I want a complete procedural breakdown of how restricted identification was interpreted as probable cause. Another pause. Then, and I want every decision documented that led to physical restraint. The tone never rose, but the weight of each sentence increased anyway. Briggs felt something tightening in his chest again. Not fear of prison, not fear of consequences. Something worse. Understanding. Understanding that this wasn't going to be resolved by apology or explanation. Because what had happened here wasn't just a mistake in judgment. It was a breakdown in assumption filtering at every level that touched Evelyn Carter's presence. The general finally looked back at his wife. And his voice softened again. "This shouldn't have happened," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded slightly. "I know." But then she added something that made the entire room go still again. "It's not the first time." And for the first time since the convoy arrived, the general's expression changed. Not loudly. Not visibly dramatic, but enough for everyone in that room to understand. This wasn't just an incident anymore. It was a pattern someone had finally decided would not continue unchecked. The words asterisk, "It's not the first time," asterisk hung in the air longer than anything else that had been said all night. Even the sound of the rain outside seemed to dull for a moment, as if the world itself was pausing to register the weight of what she had just revealed. The general didn't respond immediately. That silence wasn't confusion. It was control. The kind of control that comes from processing something serious without allowing emotion to interrupt judgment. Briggs, however, couldn't maintain that same stillness. His mind immediately tried to fill in the gap Evelyn had created. Not the current situation, not this gas station, but something larger. A pattern, a history. Evelyn had said it plainly, without emphasis, without drama. Which made it worse. Because people don't usually emphasize what has already become normal to them. The general finally spoke, his voice lower now. "Explain." Evelyn exhaled slowly, as though she had anticipated this question far longer than tonight. "I've been questioned before," she said. Stopped. Delayed. Verified. Looked at twice as long as necessary. Each time it ends the same way. She paused briefly. Someone decides I don't match what they think I should be near. No anger. No bitterness. Just fact. The cashier visibly shifted behind the counter, suddenly unable to find comfort in anything around him. The customer near the coffee station looked down at the floor completely now, his earlier confidence gone as if it had never existed. The general's jaw tightened slightly. "Why was this never reported at scale?" he asked. Evelyn gave a faint, almost tired half shrug. "Because most of the time, it doesn't escalate far enough to matter." That sentence changed the tone in the room again. Not louder, heavier. Because it implied something far more uncomfortable than a single incident. It implied repetition without consequence. Briggs felt it land in his chest like a slow impact. He had been trained to look for wrongdoing. But what he was hearing now wasn't wrongdoing in the traditional sense. It was pattern behavior, quiet, normalized, and often unexamined until it accumulated into something undeniable. The general turned slightly toward the federal officials again. "How many times has Mrs. Carter's identity flagged law enforcement systems in the last 5 years?" One of the officials hesitated. Then answered carefully. "Multiple jurisdictions, sir." Briggs looked up sharply. That was not what he expected to hear. Not at all. The official continued. "Most incidents resolved at verification stage." The general nodded once. "And the ones that didn't?" Silence again. The official answered more quietly this time. "This is the most severe escalation." The words settled into the room like cold metal. Briggs suddenly felt his mouth dry. Because for the first time, he wasn't just being evaluated for what happened tonight. He was being placed inside a broader system he hadn't even known existed. Evelyn remained still, watching none of them in particular now. Her posture wasn't defensive. It wasn't even emotional. It was tired acceptance. The kind that comes from understanding how often explanation doesn't prevent repetition. The general turned back toward her. "This ends," he said firmly. Not as reassurance, as instruction. Evelyn nodded slightly. "I know." But then she added something quieter. "It only ends if people understand why it keeps starting." That line changed something in the general's expression. Not disagreement, recognition. Because it wasn't about this moment anymore. It was about everything that allowed moments like this to happen in the first place. Briggs finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "General, I didn't know who she was." The general looked at him. And for the first time, there was something colder in his expression. "I'm not concerned with what you knew," he said. Briggs blinked. "I'm concerned with what you assumed." That distinction hit harder than anything else so far. Because it removed ignorance as a defense. The room stayed silent. The federal officials didn't intervene. The cashier didn't move. Even the rain outside seemed distant now. The general turned slightly toward Evelyn again, his tone softening once more. "We're leaving this place," he said. But Evelyn didn't move immediately. She looked once more at the room. At the cashier. At the customer who had called suspicion into existence. At Briggs. Not with anger. Not with revenge. But with something far more unsettling. Clarity. Then she spoke one final sentence before stepping forward. "Next time," she said quietly, "someone like me won't need a general to be believed." And with that, she walked toward the exit. Not as someone rescued, but as someone who had simply outlasted being misunderstood. The moment Evelyn stepped out of the gas station, the entire room felt like it had been stripped of its center of gravity. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was unmistakable. Like a conversation that suddenly loses the person everyone was unconsciously listening to. Outside, the convoy remained still, engines idling quietly in the mist. The rain had softened into a fine drizzle now, barely visible under the glow of streetlights. Everything looked calmer than it had any right to feel. But inside the gas station, no one was calm. Briggs stood exactly where he had been, still processing the last sentence she had said. "Next time, someone like me won't need a general to be believed." Asterisk. It didn't sound like a threat. It didn't sound like revenge. It sounded like exhaustion shaped into truth. And that made it harder to dismiss. The general followed Evelyn outside without looking back at anyone else in the room. The federal officials moved with him immediately, maintaining formation without instruction. It was instinct at this point, not coordination. Briggs finally exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. But it didn't bring relief. It brought awareness. Awareness of everything that had already been recorded. Everything that had already been reviewed. Everything that was no longer contained within this moment. The cashier slowly sat down behind the counter, as if his legs had stopped supporting him properly. The customer near the coffee station had completely stopped pretending to matter in the situation. He kept his head lowered, staring at nothing. The younger officer finally entered again from outside, his face pale. He looked at Briggs, and for the first time all night, there was no confusion in his expression. Only certainty. "We're done here," he said quietly. Briggs frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" The younger officer hesitated, then answered honestly. "It means this isn't ours anymore." That sentence landed heavier than anything the federal officials had said. Because it confirmed what Briggs had been resisting internally for the last hour. Control had already been taken from them. Outside, Evelyn paused briefly near the SUV. The general stood beside her now, speaking quietly, too softly for anyone inside the gas station to hear. Whatever he said, it made her close her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing something she had been carrying alone for longer than tonight. Then she nodded once. Not emotional, not broken, just acknowledged. One of the federal officials opened the door for her. She didn't hesitate this time. But before she got in, she turned slightly back toward the gas station. Not toward Briggs specifically. Not toward the cashier. Not toward anyone individually. Just the place itself. And for a brief second, she looked almost like she was memorizing it. Not because it mattered, but because moments like this tend to repeat in different forms if they're never understood properly. Then she got inside. The door closed softly, and the vehicle pulled away. The convoy followed, leaving behind only the sound of rain and distant engines fading into the road. Inside the gas station, silence stretched. Not empty silence, heavy silence. The kind that forms when everyone understands something irreversible has already happened, even if no official statement has been made yet. Briggs finally spoke, almost to himself. "This is going to end my career." The younger officer didn't correct him, didn't comfort him, just replied honestly, "That's not the part you should be thinking about." Briggs looked at him. "What is?" The younger officer paused, then said quietly, "How easily you believed you were right." That question stayed longer than anything else. Outside, the convoy disappeared into the mist completely. And the gas station, once just a routine stop on a quiet road, was left behind with a truth no one inside would be able to forget easily. Power had not been challenged that night. It had simply been revealed. The night didn't return to normal after the convoy disappeared. It only pretended to. The gas station lights were still on. The rain still fell lightly. A few cars still passed on the distant highway. But inside the building, something fundamental had changed. Not physically, perceptually. Briggs stood near the counter now, motionless, staring at the spot where Evelyn had been sitting only minutes earlier. The empty chair looked ordinary, but his mind refused to treat it that way anymore. Because now it wasn't just a chair. It was a reminder of everything that had unfolded around it. The cashier finally broke the silence first. Is that it?" he asked cautiously. No one answered immediately. The younger officer exhaled slowly, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "No," he said quietly. "That's not it." Briggs looked at him sharply. "What do you mean that's not it?" The younger officer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I mean this doesn't stay here." Briggs didn't respond, because he already knew. It never stayed here. Not when federal officials were involved. Not when restricted clearance systems were accessed. Not when body cam footage had already been flagged and extracted in real time. The younger officer continued, voice lower now. "Internal Affairs will review everything. Federal oversight will likely request full departmental audit. And whatever assumptions were made tonight," he paused. "They're documented." Briggs felt something tighten in his chest again. Documented. That word had a different weight now. Because documentation wasn't just record keeping anymore. It was permanence. The cashier finally spoke again, quieter this time. "So, she's really married to someone that important?" Briggs didn't answer. Not because he didn't know. But because the question felt too small now. Because the real issue was never whether her husband was important. The real issue was how quickly importance had been assigned and removed based on appearance alone. Outside, the rain began to lighten further, turning into a mist that blurred the edges of the parking lot. The empty space where the convoy had been now looked like it belonged to another reality entirely. Briggs slowly sat down on the edge of a bench near the entrance. For the first time all night, his body felt the full weight of what had happened. Not emotionally. Procedurally. He replayed every moment in his head without meaning to. The tone of his questions. The way he interrupted her explanations. The confidence in his assumptions. The dismissal of verification requests. Each memory now felt different than it had in real time. Because now there was no certainty protecting it. Only consequence. The younger officer stood nearby, watching him. After a moment, he spoke again. "She wasn't trying to prove anything," he said quietly. Briggs looked up slightly. The younger officer continued. "She didn't escalate. She didn't threaten. She didn't even argue." A pause. "She just answered everything calmly." Briggs closed his eyes briefly. Because that was the part he couldn't escape. She had not behaved like someone hiding something. She had behaved like someone who already knew how often being calm changes nothing when perception is already fixed. The cashier suddenly spoke again, more softly than before. "I thought we were just being careful." Briggs opened his eyes. And for the first time, he didn't respond defensively. Because, careful, was not what had happened. Careful involves evidence. Careful involves hesitation. Careful involves verification before escalation. What happened tonight had bypassed careful entirely. The younger officer adjusted his stance. "Look," he said, "if there's anything you should understand before reports start getting written, it's this." Briggs looked at him. The younger officer hesitated, then said it plainly. "We didn't stop a suspicious person." A pause. "We escalated a misunderstanding into something it never needed to become." That sentence landed heavily. Because it removed all ambiguity. No villains. No deception. Just failure of judgment under assumption. Briggs slowly leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. For the first time, his voice softened. "I didn't think it would go this far." The younger officer didn't immediately respond. Then said quietly, "That's the problem." Silence returned again. Not the tense silence from earlier. A different kind. The kind that settles in after realization replaces denial. Outside, the gas station stood unchanged. But inside it, nothing felt the same anymore. Not the counters. Not the lights. Not the people. Because everyone present now understood something they couldn't unlearn. The situation had never been about authority. It had been about assumption meeting reality, and losing instantly. The silence inside the gas station stretched longer than anyone seemed willing to break. Even the fluorescent hum overhead felt louder now, as if the building itself was uncomfortable being the only thing still functioning normally after everything that had happened. Briggs finally stood up again, slower this time, as though every movement required more thought than before. He looked toward the door where Evelyn had stood. Then toward the empty parking lot. Then back down at the floor. Nothing had physically changed in the environment. And yet everything felt altered. The younger officer checked his phone again, then slipped it back into his pocket without saying anything. Whatever messages he had received were not meant to be shared casually anymore. The cashier eventually spoke, voice uncertain. "So, what happens now?" Briggs didn't answer immediately. Because, now, was no longer a simple concept. Now included reports. Now included internal investigations. Now included federal review boards. Now included recordings being analyzed frame by people who were not present but would still decide what had happened. Finally, Briggs spoke quietly. "Now we wait." The words felt hollow even to him. The younger officer turned slightly toward him. "That's not really accurate," he said. Briggs frowned faintly. "What do you mean?" The younger officer hesitated, then answered honestly. "Now we explain." Briggs looked at him. "And what exactly do we explain?" The younger officer didn't hesitate this time. "The part where we decided she was suspicious before we confirmed anything about her." That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else had. Because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was procedural truth. And procedural truth is harder to escape than opinion. Briggs slowly exhaled through his nose. For the first time, his tone wasn't defensive. "It didn't feel like that at the time," he said quietly. The younger officer nodded slightly. "That's also the problem." Outside, a faint breeze moved through the empty parking lot, pushing the last remnants of rainwater across the pavement. The tire marks left by the convoy were already fading into reflection and distance. But mentally, none of them were leaving that moment behind. The cashier leaned slightly against the counter now, trying to process something he didn't have language for. "I just thought," he started, then stopped. Briggs glanced at him. "You thought what?" The cashier swallowed. "I thought I was doing the right thing." No one responded immediately. Because that statement didn't feel entirely wrong. But it also didn't feel entirely complete. The younger officer spoke carefully. "Intent isn't the issue," he said. The cashier looked at him. Then what is? The younger officer paused, then answered in a lower tone. Impact. Briggs looked down again. Impact. That word settled into him differently than everything else. Because impact removed excuses. It removed intention. It removed how it felt in the moment. And left only what remained after everything was recorded, reviewed, and interpreted by systems larger than personal perspective. Briggs rubbed his face slowly. I didn't think she was who she said she was, he admitted quietly. The younger officer responded immediately. She didn't need you to believe her, he said. Briggs looked up. The younger officer continued. She just needed you to verify before you acted. That distinction sat heavily between them. Because it exposed the exact failure point. Not lack of information, not lack of access, but sequence, assumption before verification. Briggs nodded slowly, almost to himself. That's going to be in the report, he said. The younger officer didn't sugarcoat it. Yes. Another silence followed, longer this time. Outside, a single car passed on the road beyond the station, its headlights briefly illuminating the empty space where everything had unfolded. Then it was gone. Briggs finally spoke again, softer than before. She said this wasn't the first time. The younger officer nodded. Yes. Briggs looked at him. Then why did it feel like we were the first ones to see it? The younger officer paused, then answered honestly. Because we were the first ones who didn't stop it early enough. That answer didn't fix anything. But it clarified everything. Briggs slowly looked back toward the empty entrance. And for the first time, his thoughts weren't about punishment. They were about recognition. Recognition that systems don't fail in dramatic moments. They fail in small decisions made confidently, when they should have been questioned first. The gas station felt quieter than it should have for a place still lit and open. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet, the kind that lingers after something significant has already left the room. Briggs remained standing near the entrance now, staring out into the dim parking lot. His reflection faintly appeared in the glass door, uniform slightly damp, posture less certain than before. It didn't feel like looking at himself anymore. It felt like looking at a version of himself from earlier in the night, someone who had acted with absolute certainty about things that now felt dangerously incomplete. Behind him, the younger officer finally broke the silence. They'll ask for a statement, he said. Briggs didn't turn around. I know. And they'll compare it to body cam. I know that too. Another pause followed. Then the younger officer added something more carefully. And they'll ask why it escalated the way it did. That sentence finally pulled Briggs away from the glass. He turned slightly. What answer do you give to that? He asked quietly. The younger officer didn't respond immediately. Because there wasn't a comfortable answer. Eventually, he spoke. The truth. Briggs gave a faint, almost humorless exhale. The truth doesn't always sound good on paper. The younger officer nodded once. No, he agreed. But it's still the truth. That silence returned again, but it wasn't as heavy this time. It had shifted into something more reflective. Across the room, the cashier began cleaning the counter again, not because it needed cleaning, but because stillness had become uncomfortable. Repetition gave his hands something to do while his mind caught up with everything it had witnessed. Briggs noticed him. You didn't do anything wrong, Briggs said suddenly. The cashier paused, then looked up slowly. Briggs continued, though his voice lacked the firmness it once had. You made a call based on what you thought was suspicious. The cashier hesitated. That's what I thought I was supposed to do. Briggs nodded slightly. That part isn't the issue. The cashier frowned faintly. Then what is? Briggs looked away for a moment. Because answering honestly meant acknowledging something uncomfortable about how easily the situation formed in the first place. Finally, he said it. The issue is how quickly it became certainty. The cashier lowered his eyes again. That sentence seemed to settle into him differently than the others. Because it didn't accuse. It explained. Outside, the wind moved lightly across the empty pavement, shifting small reflections of light across the wet ground. The absence of vehicles made the space feel larger than it was. Too large. Like something important had already been removed from it. The younger officer stepped closer to Briggs again. "They're going to want a timeline," he said. Briggs nodded. "And witness accounts." Briggs nodded again. "In justification for escalation at each stage." Briggs closed his eyes briefly. Because now the structure of the entire night was being broken down into components that didn't feel like a story anymore. Just decisions. One after another. Each one, smaller than the last when viewed alone. But together forming something far more serious. He opened his eyes. "I didn't think she was being honest," he said quietly. The younger officer didn't respond immediately. Then said gently, "That's not what the footage shows." Briggs looked at him. The younger officer continued, "She didn't change her story once. That landed differently. Because it removed one of the only justifications Briggs had been holding onto internally." He looked down again, not in shame, in recognition. "I escalated it," he admitted. The younger officer didn't correct him. Didn't soften it. Just nodded once. "Yes." Silence followed again. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was processing. Outside, the station sign flickered faintly for a moment before stabilizing again. Life continuing in small mechanical ways, unaffected by human consequence. Inside, Briggs finally spoke again. "She didn't look like someone connected to that level of authority," he said quietly. The younger officer responded carefully. "Most people don't." That sentence lingered longer than expected. Because it pointed toward the deeper issue without naming it directly. Assumption doesn't rely on facts. It relies on expectation. Briggs slowly straightened his posture again, though not fully returning to his earlier stance. "She was right," he said. The younger officer looked at him. Briggs continued quietly. "When she said we decided who she was before we asked." No one corrected him. Because there was nothing to correct. Only acknowledgement. The cashier finally stopped wiping the counter and stood still, as if realizing the night was no longer something he could distract himself from. Briggs looked back outside one more time. The road was empty again. But his mind wasn't. And for the first time since everything began, the question forming in his thoughts wasn't about what would happen next. It was simpler. And harder. How many other moments like this had already happened, without anyone realizing it had gone too far? Briggs didn't answer that question out loud. But it stayed with him anyway. Not as an abstract thought anymore, but as something uncomfortable and personal, because once you recognize a pattern, it stops being something out there, and starts becoming something you have to measure yourself against. The younger officer broke the silence first. "They'll take statements separately," he said. "Then IA will reconstruct everything." Briggs nodded slowly. "Yeah, and your command will likely pull you from active duty pending review." Another pause. Briggs didn't react immediately. Not because he didn't understand. But because hearing it said plainly made it more real than thinking it privately ever could. The cashier looked between them cautiously. "So, you're suspended?" he asked. Briggs exhaled through his nose. "Probably." The word didn't sound like anger or disbelief anymore. It sounded like acceptance trying to catch up to reality. Outside, the mist had almost completely replaced the rain now. The convoy was gone. The general was gone. Evelyn was gone. But nothing about the night felt finished. Because consequences don't arrive in a single moment. They unfold. Slowly. Systematically. The younger officer adjusted his stance slightly. "You know what's going to matter most in the report?" he asked. Briggs looked at him. The younger officer continued without waiting. "Not that she was related to a 4-star general." A pause. "But that we didn't confirm anything before escalating force." Briggs nodded faintly. "I understand." The younger officer studied him for a moment. Then added something quieter. "And that we treated her uncertainty as deception." That line hit differently. Because it reframed everything. Briggs slowly looked toward the empty counter where Evelyn had stood earlier. For a brief second, He could almost reconstruct the moment again, not as he experienced it, but as it likely appeared from her perspective. Walking in, calm, tired, unassuming, then questioned, then doubted, then escalated, then restrained, not because of what she did, but because of what she was assumed to be. He closed his eyes briefly. And this time, it wasn't denial. It was understanding arriving late. Outside, a distant set of headlights passed along the highway, briefly illuminating the gas station before fading again into darkness. The cashier spoke again, softer now. Is she going to press charges? Briggs opened his eyes. He didn't answer immediately, because that wasn't a question he could answer with certainty. The younger officer responded instead. That's not really how this works, he said. The cashier frowned slightly. What do you mean? The younger officer looked toward the road where the convoy had disappeared. It's not about what she wants, he said quietly. It's about what the system decides it has to fix. That statement hung in the air longer than anything else that night. Because it implied something larger than punishment. It implied correction. Briggs slowly straightened again, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. I should have verified first, he said quietly. No one argued with him. Because it was no longer a debate. It was documented fact. The younger officer nodded once. Yes. A long pause followed. Then Briggs added something quieter. I thought I was being careful. The younger officer responded without judgment. You were being confident. That distinction lingered. Because it separated intention from execution. Carefulness requires doubt. Confidence removes it. Briggs looked down at the floor again. And for the first time, he didn't try to justify it internally. He simply acknowledged it. Outside, the gas station sign flickered again, then steadied. Life continuing, unaware, or perhaps just indifferent. Inside, the younger officer finally spoke again. They'll probably ask if you felt she was dangerous. Briggs gave a faint, almost tired shake of his head. No, he said quietly. A pause. I never thought she was dangerous. The younger officer looked at him. Briggs continued. I just thought she didn't belong in the situation she was in. Silence followed, because that sentence revealed more than anything else that had been said all night. Not fear, not threat perception. Belonging, or lack of it. The cashier lowered his gaze again, quietly processing that idea. Briggs looked toward the door one final time. And in a lower voice, almost to himself, he said. That's what started all of this. No one corrected him, because for the first time, everyone understood exactly what he meant. The room stayed quiet after Briggs spoke those words. That's what started all of this. Not a dramatic statement, not an accusation, just a realization finally spoken out loud. The younger officer leaned against the counter slightly, exhaling as if the weight of the night was only now settling fully into his body. Yeah, he said quietly. That's usually how it starts. Briggs glanced at him. What do you mean? The younger officer looked down for a moment before answering. Most of the time, it doesn't start with wrongdoing, he said. It starts with assumption. Someone doesn't match what we expect, and we fill in the blanks before verifying anything. That sentence didn't sound theoretical. It sounded experienced. The cashier, still standing near the register, finally spoke again. So, this happens a lot. The younger officer hesitated, then answered honestly. More than people think. Briggs didn't respond, because now the night wasn't just about Evelyn anymore. It had expanded into something larger. A system, a pattern, a behavior repeated enough times that it had become invisible until it escalated into something undeniable. He rubbed the side of his face slowly. I didn't see it that way, he admitted. The younger officer nodded slightly. Most people don't, until they have to. A long silence followed. Outside, the fog had thickened slightly again, softening the edges of the parking lot lights. The world beyond the gas station felt distant now, almost detached, as if nothing important could happen there anymore. Everything important had already happened inside. Briggs walked slowly toward the entrance again, stopping just short of the glass door. He looked at his reflection. For a second, he didn't see an officer. He saw someone who had made a decision quickly, and confidently, and incorrectly. Not out of malice, out of certainty. And certainty, he was beginning to understand, was not always a virtue. The younger officer approached beside him. "They'll want your full statement tomorrow," he said. Briggs nodded faintly. "And your body cam explanation." Another nod. "And Ia will likely reconstruct the full timeline from the cashier, witnesses, and federal logs." Briggs closed his eyes briefly. "Yeah," he said again. This time softer. The younger officer studied him for a moment. "You okay?" he asked. Briggs gave a faint, almost unconvincing half-shrug. "I don't think that's the right question." The younger officer tilted his head slightly. "What is?" Briggs opened his eyes again and looked out at the empty road. "I think the question is whether I understood what I was doing at the time," he said quietly. A pause. "And I didn't." The younger officer didn't argue. Because there was nothing to argue against. The cashier finally turned off the coffee machine behind the counter. The sudden quiet mechanical shutdown made the room feel even emptier. Briggs turned back inside slowly. "This is going to follow me," he said. The younger officer nodded. "Yes." Another pause. Then Briggs added something quieter. "But it should." The younger officer looked at him again, slightly surprised by the honesty. Briggs continued. "Because if I don't carry it forward, then I'll just repeat it somewhere else without realizing it." That statement hung differently in the room. Not as punishment, as understanding. Outside, a single distant car passed again along the highway, its headlights briefly brushing across the windows before disappearing. The younger officer pushed off the counter. "I'll file my preliminary report," he said. Briggs nodded once. "Yeah." The younger officer paused at the door. Then added, without turning around. "For what it's worth, she wasn't trying to fight you." Briggs looked at him. The younger officer continued quietly. "She was just waiting to be treated like what she actually was." Then he stepped outside into the fog. Briggs stayed inside, still. And for the first time since the night began, the silence didn't feel like aftermath. It felt like reflection that had arrived too late to change anything, but just in time to make sure it wouldn't be ignored again. The gas station felt different after the younger officer left. Not quieter, more final, like the night had moved from event to record. Briggs remained inside alone now, standing near the glass door, watching the fog blur the empty road. The cashier had retreated behind the counter without speaking again, and the hum of the overhead lights felt louder than it should have. There was no more urgency. No more vehicles arriving. No more voices from federal officials. Only aftermath. And aftermath is where consequences stop feeling external and start becoming internal. Briggs slowly sat down on one of the small benches near the entrance. For a moment, he just stared at his hands. They looked the same as they had earlier in the night. But they didn't feel the same. He replayed the moment again without wanting to. Evelyn standing calmly, answering without panic, asking questions instead of resisting, offering explanations that were dismissed not because they were unclear, but because they didn't match what had already been assumed. He exhaled slowly. It wasn't just the escalation that bothered him now. It was how natural it had felt while it was happening. That was the part he couldn't ignore. The cashier finally spoke again, cautiously. "Officer." Briggs looked up slightly. The cashier hesitated before continuing. "Am I in trouble for calling it in?" Briggs paused, then shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "A beat. You did what you thought was right." The cashier nodded, but it didn't fully relax him. Because that answer didn't remove responsibility from the situation, it only redistributed it. Briggs continued quietly. "But next time, you should slow down before you decide what you're seeing means." The cashier looked down. "I didn't mean for it to become all that." Briggs gave a faint, tired breath. None of us did. That sentence lingered, because it applied more broadly than either of them wanted to admit. Outside, a faint wind moved through the empty lot, shifting the last remaining mist across the pavement like smoke dispersing after something burned out. Briggs stood up again slowly. He walked toward the counter this time, stopping a few feet away. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he asked quietly. The cashier looked at him. Briggs didn't wait for permission to continue. "Not the arrest," he said. "Not the federal response." A pause. The moment she asked if I was sure. He looked down slightly. "That wasn't sarcasm," he added. "That was warning." The cashier didn't respond, because there was nothing to add. Briggs leaned slightly against the counter. "I heard her," he said quietly. "But I didn't understand her." The cashier frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Briggs looked up. "I thought she was challenging me," he said. A pause. "But she was trying to stop me from crossing a line I couldn't see yet." Silence returned again, this one heavier than before. Because now the misunderstanding wasn't about identity or status. It was about interpretation. And interpretation is where most irreversible decisions begin. Briggs straightened again slowly. "I'm going to write it exactly as it happened," he said. The cashier nodded. Briggs continued. "Even the parts that make me look wrong." The cashier hesitated. "Will that help?" Briggs paused for a long moment. Then answered honestly. "No. A beat. But it'll make it true." That was the difference he was starting to understand. Truth wasn't about outcome. It was about accuracy, even when it was uncomfortable. Outside, the fog had thinned slightly, revealing more of the empty road again. But it didn't feel like clarity. It felt like exposure. Briggs looked toward the place where Evelyn had stood earlier one last time. Not as a suspect, not as a wife of a general, but as a person who had been correctly described and still not correctly believed. He exhaled slowly, and for the first time that night, he didn't try to rewrite what happened in his mind. He just accepted it, because some moments don't end when the people leave. They end when everyone finally understands why they happened at all. Briggs stayed by the counter a while longer than he intended. Not because there was anything left to do, but because leaving meant stepping fully into what came next. And what came next would not be quiet. The cashier eventually began shutting down small sections of the station, turning off unused lights, checking locks, moving through motions that felt automatic but distant. The younger officer had already left. The federal presence was gone. Even the road outside had settled into near total emptiness. But the night itself hadn't ended. It had only shifted form. Briggs finally walked back toward the entrance again, stopping at the glass door. His reflection stared back at him faintly, less sharp now, almost diluted by the fog outside. He thought about Evelyn again. Not the moment she was detained. Not the moment the general arrived. But the moment she simply stood there and said, "It only ends if people understand why it keeps starting." Asterisk. He hadn't understood that fully at the time. Now he did, and that realization carried more weight than any disciplinary outcome ever could. The cashier's voice came from behind him. "Are they going to come back?" Briggs didn't turn around immediately. "Who?" he asked. "The federal people." Briggs shook his head slightly. "No," he said. A pause. "Not unless something else happens." The cashier frowned. "Like what?" Briggs finally turned back toward him. "Like someone doesn't learn from tonight." That answer wasn't meant to scare him. But it landed that way anyway. Because it implied continuity, not closure. Briggs stepped outside slowly into the mist. The air was cooler now, quieter, almost indifferent to everything that had unfolded here. He stood near the edge of the parking lot, looking at the empty space where the convoy had been. It felt strange how quickly power could arrive, and how quietly it could leave. No celebration, no announcement, just removal. He thought about his career, about reports, about internal affairs, about federal review boards dissecting every second of the footage. None of it felt abstract anymore. It felt inevitable. But beneath that, something else had started forming. Not fear. Not regret alone. Understanding of scale. He hadn't just misjudged a person. He had misjudged a structure he didn't realize he was interacting with. And structures like that don't forget easily. Behind him, the door opened again. The cashier stepped out briefly, holding a small trash bag. "You leaving soon?" he asked cautiously. Briggs nodded slowly. "Yeah." The cashier hesitated. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Briggs looked toward the road again before answering. "She was okay the whole time," he said quietly. A pause. "We just didn't recognize it fast enough." The cashier didn't respond, because there was nothing to correct in that statement. Only something uncomfortable to accept. Briggs took a slow breath, then added, "The question now isn't about her." The cashier looked at him. Briggs continued, "It's about how often this happens when nobody important is watching." That sentence hung between them. Not dramatic, not emotional, just true enough to be unsettling. A car passed far in the distance, headlights briefly cutting through the mist before disappearing again. Briggs finally started walking toward his vehicle. Each step felt lighter than earlier in the night. Not because the consequences were gone, but because denial was. And denial, he realized, had been doing more work than he ever gave it credit for. As he reached his car, he paused one last time. Looking back at the gas station. Ordinary again, lights on, open, functioning, but no longer innocent in his perception. Because now it carried memory. And memory changes how places exist in your mind forever. Briggs opened the door slowly. Before getting in, he said quietly to himself, not to anyone else, "I should have listened sooner." Then he closed the door and drove into the mist. The road ahead felt longer than it was. Briggs didn't drive fast. He didn't need to. There was nowhere left to outrun the night, and nothing left to catch up to. Every few seconds, his mind replayed fragments of what had been said inside the gas station, not as a continuous story, but as isolated sentences that refused to lose their meaning. "Did you place her under investigative detention? Asterisk. Restricted federal clearance. Asterisk. It only ends if people understand why it keeps starting. Asterisk. Each one landed differently now. Not because they were new. Because he finally understood them in sequence." Briggs tightened his grip on the steering wheel slightly as he drove through the empty stretch of road. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about what he would say in his report. He was thinking about what the report would say about him. That distinction mattered more than he expected. Not legally, but internally. Because reports didn't just document actions. They preserved judgment. Behind him, the gas station was already out of sight. But it didn't feel distant. It felt like it was still happening somewhere, just without him present to influence the outcome anymore. That realization unsettled him more than anything else. Not loss of control, but recognition that control had been an illusion shaped by proximity. He exhaled slowly. In his mind, Evelyn's voice returned again, not loud, not forceful, but steady. "People decide who I am before they ask." Asterisk. Briggs glanced briefly at the passenger seat, as if expecting something to respond. Nothing did. The road curved gently ahead, illuminated by sparse streetlights that faded in and out of visibility through the mist. He thought about the younger officer. About how quickly certainty had dissolved when systems responded faster than human interpretation. About how quickly confidence had shifted when external validation replaced internal assumption. And then, more uncomfortably, he thought about how normal the beginning had felt. A gas station, a late-night stop, a brief interaction, a suspicion, a call, a response. Nothing about it had felt extraordinary in the moment. And yet, everything about it had escalated into something that clearly belonged in a different category entirely. Briggs slowed slightly at a junction. He wasn't lost, but he wasn't fully present either. His thoughts kept pulling him backward. Not to the outcome, but to the starting point. The moment Evelyn first walked in. Calm, unassuming, composed, and how quickly that composure had been interpreted as concealment. He frowned slightly. That was the part that bothered him most now. Not that he was wrong, but how easily being calm became suspicious. How easily confidence became threat. How easily presence became question. His phone vibrated briefly on the dashboard. He glanced at it. Unknown departmental notification. He didn't open it immediately, because he already knew what it likely contained. Acknowledgement. Review notice. Temporary suspension. Procedural summaries beginning their long process of formalization. Instead, he kept driving. The mist outside thickened again slightly as the road stretched forward into darker terrain. Briggs spoke quietly to himself without meaning to. I escalated it too fast. The words didn't feel like confession anymore. They felt like classification, like something being placed correctly in a system after being misfiled. He paused, then added more quietly, and I didn't realize I was escalating it. That second sentence mattered more, because it removed intention as an excuse. Intentions could be misunderstood, but awareness was harder to defend. A few more minutes passed in silence. Then Briggs thought of something else Evelyn had said earlier. Not during confrontation, but during stillness. I've been stopped before. Asterisk. That line lingered differently now, because it implied experience, not surprise, not shock, but repetition. Briggs tightened his jaw slightly. And for the first time, he asked himself a question he hadn't considered at the station. How many times does something have to happen before it stops being an isolated incident? He didn't answer it, because he couldn't. Not yet. The road straightened ahead. The mist thinned slightly. And somewhere behind him, far away now, the gas station remained exactly where it had always been. Unchanged physically, but no longer the same in anyone's memory who had been inside it that night. Briggs eventually pulled over, not because something forced him to, but because continuing to drive without thinking clearly no longer felt safe in a different sense. He cut the engine and sat in silence. The night outside the windshield was quiet again, just mist drifting under faint roadside light. No sirens, no movement, no urgency left anywhere in sight. Only reflection. He leaned back slightly in the seat, exhaling slowly. Now that he wasn't actively inside the situation, his mind began reconstructing it differently. Less emotional fragments, more structure, sequence, arrival, suspicion, detention, verification attempt, federal escalation, General Carter. Each step felt small on its own, but together they formed something that no longer resembled a routine police interaction. It resembled failure of interpretation under pressure. Briggs rubbed his forehead slowly. The hardest part wasn't remembering what he did. It was recognizing how reasonable it had felt while doing it. That was the part that unsettled him most. Because it suggested the problem wasn't just judgment. It was calibration. What he considered reasonable suspicion had been triggered too quickly, too confidently, too easily reinforced by others in the room. The cashier, the customer, even his own internal bias toward what fit and what didn't. He closed his eyes briefly and saw Evelyn again, not reacting emotionally, not escalating, not resisting, just answering, consistently, calmly, and still being pushed further into suspicion because calmness itself had been misread as concealment. Briggs opened his eyes again. That pattern bothered him more than anything else, because it meant the system didn't just react to behavior. It interpreted personality. Outside, a distant truck passed somewhere far down the road, its sound fading quickly into the fog. Briggs reached for his phone again. This time, he opened the notification. It was exactly what he expected. A formal notice acknowledging initiation of internal review. Temporary administrative suspension pending investigation. Requirement to submit full written report within 24 hours. He stared at it for a long moment. Not reacting, just reading. Then he locked the phone and set it down again. No anger, no denial, just inevitability. He He exhaled again. "This is what happens," he said quietly to himself. Not in frustration. In recognition. The words didn't feel like punishment. They felt like consequence unfolding at its natural pace. A few seconds passed. Then another thought surfaced, less comfortable than the rest. Evelyn hadn't tried to prove anything aggressively. She hadn't needed to. The system had done it for her. Automatically. Instantly. That wasn't what Briggs had expected. He had expected resistance to be the trigger. But instead, it was recognition by external authority that ended the ambiguity. That realization stayed with him. Because it meant something uncomfortable. He hadn't been corrected by argument. He had been corrected by hierarchy. And that meant the initial judgment had been left unchallenged long enough to escalate. Briggs looked out at the fog again. And for the first time, the question he asked himself wasn't about tonight. It was about everything that came before it. How many times had small assumptions like this resolved themselves quietly? Without federal intervention, without general involvement, without documentation. How many moments had passed unnoticed because they never escalated far enough to force reflection? He didn't know, and that uncertainty felt heavier than knowing. Briggs started the engine again, but didn't drive yet. He sat for a moment longer, hands resting on the wheel. Then, quietly, almost to himself, "I need to do better than this." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't absolution. Just acknowledgement that whatever he had thought, careful, meant before tonight, was no longer enough. And with that thought, he finally pulled back onto the road, disappearing into the fog with a different understanding of the same night he had already lived through once. The road ahead stayed quiet as Briggs drove, but it no longer felt empty in the same way it had earlier. Now it felt known, like something had been revealed behind it that couldn't be unseen again. He didn't rush. There was no urgency left to chase, no situation left to control. Just distance growing between him and a place that had already been fully documented in ways he would soon have to confront again on paper, in interviews, and in review boards. But the real weight wasn't procedural anymore. It was internal. Because every version of the night he replayed now led to the same point. Not a single mistake. A sequence of small certainties that never got interrupted. Briggs exhaled slowly as the headlights cut through the fog ahead. He thought again about Evelyn Carter. Not as a name attached to authority. Not as someone connected to power. But as the person who had stood in front of him and asked, calmly, if he was sure. And how little space there had been in his mind at that moment for doubt. That was the part that stayed with him. Not the escalation. Not the arrival of federal response. But the absence of pause. He tightened his grip slightly on the steering wheel. Because now he understood something he hadn't understood earlier. The system didn't collapse because of one bad decision. It bent because no one interrupted the momentum of assumptions early enough to stop it from becoming certainty. The road straightened again. Darker now. Quieter. Briggs reduced speed slightly without thinking. Not out of fear, but reflection. A patrol officer's instinct had always been to identify risk, respond, and resolve. But tonight had challenged something deeper than that instinct. It had challenged how quickly certainty was allowed to form in the first place. His phone stayed dark on the passenger seat. No more notifications. No more updates. Just silence. And for the first time since the night began, Briggs let himself sit fully inside that silence without trying to fill it with explanation. Because explanation was no longer useful. Understanding was. Behind him, far back in distance and time now, the gas station no longer mattered as a location. It mattered as an example. Of how quickly perception can harden into action. Of how easily calmness can be misread as deception. Of how authority can become blind not because of lack of information, but because of premature certainty. Briggs finally spoke quietly into the empty car, not expecting an answer. "I should have asked one more question." The words didn't change anything. But they clarified something inside him. Because the failure wasn't lack of authority. It wasn't lack of training. It was lack of pause. A moment that never happened. He drove for a few more minutes in silence. Then the road signs ahead began shifting toward more familiar routes. Home wasn't far now, but it didn't feel like arrival. It felt like transition, because what he was returning to was not the same version of himself that had left earlier that night. And that realization sat with him more quietly than any consequence ever could. As the city lights slowly began appearing in the distance, Briggs reduced speed again. Not because he was finished thinking, but because he finally understood there was nothing left to rush toward. Only something to carry forward. And in that quiet final stretch, he understood the last thing the night had been trying to show him all along. Not that he was wrong, but that certainty without reflection always arrives faster than truth.